Hey everyone, welcome to the Echo Chamber. This is Echo Wirm. I'd like to thank you for joining us tonight if you're watching live on YouTube or if you're listening later on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or even on YouTube as well. We're happy to have you guys here. Today we'll be discussing chapters 2 through 4 of the very first Harry Potter book. Of course, in most of the world, that book is referred to as Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone. If you're an American like me, it's Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone. I have both versions recorded as audiobooks. You can't find them on YouTube, but if you want to check them out, they are available for free over on both Patreon and Vimeo, patreon.com/EchoWorm, worm with an I, or like I said, on Vimeo, just search for Echo Wirm, worm with an I, over on vimeo.com. You can find the entire 7-book series, like I said, with both versions separately recorded. Philosopher's Stone is my more recent recording of it, and you can definitely tell my voice has gotten a lot more confident in my recording style with the British version than with the American version. But you can check out both of those as well as Harry Potter and the Cursed Child. I don't typically check the live chat on these just for future sake, but Matteo Bartholin is asking, why do you do more than one in an episode? The reason that we're skipping into 3 chapters this week instead of just one is there are over hundreds of chapters in the books that we want to discuss, and we don't want to be stuck on Harry Potter talking about these for the next 3 years, essentially. And so we're going to kind of bundle them together in what I think is appropriate. Today we're discussing chapters 2 through 4, which is essentially all of Harry's life prior to learning about the wizarding world. And so, of course, we did talk about The Boy Who Lived in its own separate chapter. Today we are moving into chapters 2 through 4. Those include the titles The Vanishing Glass, The Letters from No One, and The Keeper of the Keys. Like I said, if you haven't read this, or it's been a long time since you read this, and you do want to read it before you listen to this audio podcast, you're more than welcome to do so. Like I said, we have our recordings over on Patreon and Vimeo for free if you want to check them out. Those are chapters 2 through 4. But happy to have you join us if you're listening on YouTube, like I said, either live or in the future. Thank you for being here. If you're listening on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, they should be available everywhere now, probably a day after we record these live. We're trying to do these every other Thursday in kind of co-op with our live streams on the regular channel, which we do on the opposite Thursdays. But today we're going to start with The Vanishing Glass. So take yourselves back. I know last week we talked about where we were in 1981. Now fast forward almost 10 years later, the summer of 1991. Now, we talked about soccer or football last week. This summer of 1991, Arsenal just got done winning their second league title in 3 years. In terms of music, here's what was going on. A new little song just popped up on the charts from the Robin Hood soundtrack. It's called Everything I Do It For You. That is by Bryan Adams. Of course, right now it's sitting at number 8 on the charts. Eventually, it would become the number 1 song of 1991. Elsewhere on the charts, we got Do You Want Me by Salt and Peppa sitting in 5th place. And number 1 this week, for the second week in a row, Any Dream Will Do by Jason Donovan. Of course, that is in the United Kingdom. In terms of film, we talked about Robin Hood, currently sitting a lot lower on the box office charts than it would elsewhere. Number 1 right now is a film that would go on to win Best Picture, at least at the Academy Awards. A little film you may have heard of, Jodie Foster and Anthony Hopkins sitting at number 1 for the 4th week in a row, The Silence of the Lambs. Second place, maybe you haven't heard of it, maybe you have, Alfred Molina and Sally Field, Not Without My Daughter. Interesting year for films. An interesting year as we move into the 90s from the late 80s. But in June, roughly, is when we start our story. Now, like I said, this is about 10 years after the first chapter, and now we get it from Harry's perspective. So how we discuss the book on this podcast, we have kind of talked about spoilers a little bit. Most spoilers we will include for just this book specifically. So if you haven't read all of Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone or Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone, then I encourage you to do so. I will try not to skip too far ahead and reveal the major twist of this book, but we will kind of talk about some foreshadowing for just certain characters in some of these chapters. Not these chapters specifically, but as we move further on in the book, we'll talk about them. Now, I first read this book when I was about 6 years old. It was right after the sixth book came out in the summer of 2005. And I knew all of the main characters in this book, but I didn't know the progression of the book. And so I'll talk a little bit about that when we get to some of these chapters going forward, just my personal experiences with these books. If you guys have personal anecdotes that you want to share about the chapters that we cover, or questions that you have about the chapters that we cover, you're always welcome to leave comments either in the live chat or down in the comments on YouTube, or like I said, if you're listening over on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, feel free to email any questions you have to EchoWirm, of course, worm with an I, at gmail.com, and we'll try to include them in future live streams. But the first chapter, The Vanishing Glass, we're introduced to Harry Potter and his family life at the Dursleys. And now the Dursleys, we talked a little bit about their pretension, if that's even a word, their pretentiousness and their just their overall self-aggrandizement in the previous chapter. Everything is perfect in their world, or they're trying to make everything perfect from an outsider perspective. And we really see that with the way that they treat their son, and especially the way that they treat their nephew, Harry. They do not want anything to do with Harry, to the point that he is an afterthought. He's basically a household slave to them. And they have him locked in the cupboard under the stairs, or the closet, if you're an American, is probably a better understanding of that term. When I first read the book, of course, like I said, I was 6 years old, and they use the word cupboard. And here I'm thinking of the thing that you store your plates and dishes in your kitchen. And so I'm thinking that Harry is literally living in this tiny little cabinet space. But of course, the more proper translation is a tiny little closet that they have underneath their staircase. In my house that I grew up in, we had kind of like this pseudo storm shelter under our stairs, and it's very similar to that. The films do a very good job at kind of showing it's larger than you would expect as an American, but it's still a very claustrophobic space. And in future books, when Harry goes back and lives in the cupboard under the stairs, or at least goes back to look at it, he notes how small he must have been to even fit in there as a child. But that's his room. That's where he grows up. It's mentioned that it's a 3-bedroom house, or it might even be a 4-bedroom house. Off the top of my head, I can't remember. If it's a 4-bedroom house, they use one of them as a guest bedroom. If it's a 3-bedroom house, then either way, Dudley has 2 separate bedrooms. One is his main bedroom, and one they use for his toys. Dudley is a prat, for lack of a better term. Dudley is the sole child of the Dursleys. They worship him. They are setting him up for a pretty horrendous turnaround that we will see later on in the books going forward, and something that I'm sure you have seen in your lives with people around you, and I certainly have seen with people in my life. But growing up, those kids who are never told no, they certainly have a wonderful life and a wonderful view on life until they hit the point where they start having to take care of themselves, and the world stops catering to them. And it's, I mentioned my own stories as a parent in the last chapter, but having a son and trying to both give my son the life that I wish I had when I was younger, and also balancing the weight of expectations that the world is going to have on him, and kind of, it's a balancing act. And some parents favor kind of the harsh realities more than they favor just the coddling of their children, and some parents are the opposite. And especially with the Dursleys, we see the opposite here. One major thing in this chapter that we see is Dudley did not get as many presents as he did the previous year. And I can't remember the exact number. I want to say he got 37 on his 10th birthday, and this year I think he gets 36, or it's either 36 and 35. Regardless, he has an obscene number of presents for his birthday, and makes a big deal about it. And then the parents apologize. They realize, okay, we're going to have to appease him and get new presents. And Harry is kind of off to the side. He's never gotten a birthday present in his life. And he just watches this unfold, and this is all normal for him, where he is living in this life as a secondary citizen. The story that we learn about him, or at least his perspective on the world, is that he believes his parents died in essentially a drunken car crash. His parents were nobodies. They never worked. And And that is the narrative that has been told to him over and over again by the Dursleys, just to kind of diminish his value in their family. He does have dreams, though, and we mentioned last week that the age at which the attack happened on Harry's parents, he would have been old enough to have a conscious memory and would have been old enough to kind of at least have some understanding of the world. Obviously, by the time he's 11 years old, he's probably not going to remember any of it. But we see that some of these memories still haunt his dreams. He talks about believing that they died in a car crash, but at the same time, he has these dreams about the car crash, and there's green light and screaming, and it's not quite matching up the way he remembers. And then, of course, by the time we get to chapter 4, which we'll talk about in a moment, things change, and his perspective shifts back to when he learns the truth. But chapter 2 is all about Dudley's birthday. His 11th birthday, he's just a few months older than Harry, and what happens is the Dursleys are going to take him and his friend, I believe, is it Piers Polkiss? They're going to take them to the zoo. And Harry is going to stay with Mrs. Figg. Now, I want to pause for those of you who have read further on in the series. This isn't a major spoiler. I'm not going to spoil anything about the character of Mrs. Figg. But she does appear later on in the series. And it's very interesting to me. I mentioned it last chapter with Sirius Black. But it's very interesting to me in these first few chapters with the Dursleys, how many characters are foreshadowed going forward. Specifically with Mrs. Figg, and then multiple times Aunt Marge, her name is dropped in this chapter. Now, of course, Aunt Marge won't show up again really until the third book, and Mrs. Figg is casually mentioned, but she doesn't make like a physical appearance in the series until book 5, and we'll definitely talk about her when we get there. But Mrs. Figg is kind of this odd neighborhood lady, just this old woman that nobody really wants to talk to, but she is kind of a safe pair of hands to drop Harry off. One that's not going to treat him too nicely, and the Dursleys can leave and know that Harry isn't being treated the greatest, but they don't have to worry about him not being safe, if that makes any sense. They're kind of looking just for this moderate location to leave him. Almost like a daycare that they can just drop him off and ignore him for several hours, which they have done basically every year on Dudley's birthday. Harry has never been to the zoo, and all of a sudden, Mrs. Figg, they find out, has broken her leg, tripping over one of her cats. And so they can't leave Harry with Mrs. Figg, and Aunt Marge isn't going to take Harry, because even as early as this chapter, we learn that Aunt Marge, who is Uncle Vernon's sister, so not even Harry's blood relative, but she absolutely hates Harry. And so we see that foreshadowed here. And so, as a result of that, having nowhere to leave Harry, they are forced to bring him along to the zoo. So this is when we shift to a new location. We go from 4 Privet Drive over to the local zoo in Little Whinging. I believe it's in Little Whinging. It could be hinted to be in London, but as far as I can remember, I think they just call it the zoo, so let's assume it's local. When we get to the zoo, if you've only ever seen the film version, there are a few differences. Specifically, there's a lot more comedy, less slapstick, but more almost childish comedy. I don't want to use the word racist, but there's slight, like, late 90s ethnic stereotype undertones with the boa constrictor. In the film, it's a Burmese python, and it's bred in captivity. It might be a boa constrictor. So back up real quick. It's interesting. We talked about last stream that we did, or last podcast that we did, that J.K. Rowling has kind of been given this reputation of changing things and refitting things to kind of change things that she didn't actually put in the books. And one thing that I wanted to mention with this scene specifically is I want to say there was a tweet at one point, or maybe even a blog post at one point, where she basically says that the snake that Harry frees in this opening chapter is the same snake as Nagini, and she's shocked that no one ever put it together. And if you guys know the post I'm talking about, let me know if you guys can find it. Feel free to, like I said, email me, or I'll put it up on the channel at some point if I can find it. But It's interesting that J.K. Rowling would say that because, especially now with the Fantastic Beasts films, when the canon has been changed, where Nagini is no longer just a snake. It's interesting that J.K. Rowling would say that, especially because in the films, and I believe in the books as well, Nagini is specifically stated to be a Burmese python, which is a large snake that comes from Burma, or modern-day Myanmar in Southeast Asia. Whereas, specifically in the book here, this snake is very specifically said to be a boa constrictor. In the films, the snake is bred in captivity. Harry has kind of this interaction with the snake. But in the books, it's a wild snake that was caught in Brazil, native to Brazil. And we get this funny interaction after the snake escapes, where he basically thanks Harry and then calls him amigo, and then says something along the lines of, Brazil, here I come, or Rio, here I come. I can't remember the exact line. But every time I read that line, I get this kind of just stereotypical, like, Brazilian cha-cha. I mean, I don't know why I'm going with this route, but, like, I think of, like, a little cutaway gag that they would do in something like The Fairly Odd Parents, where the snake escapes, says, I'm going to Brazil, and then the little music plays. But it's significantly different in the film, at least the tone that they go in this scene. But we get to the zoo, and Harry mentions that previously in his life there have been bizarre things that have happened that he can't explain or can't understand. For example, he was trying to escape bullies at school, and all of a sudden he ended up on the roof, and he has no idea how he got up there. Obviously, we understand that since he's magical, he was able to fly up there, which is a common occurrence for young wizards, just not knowing their magic and having it pop up in kind of weird situations to get out of either dangerous scenarios or uncomfortable scenarios. Another one that's mentioned in these chapters is Aunt Petunia giving Harry a haircut and his hair somehow growing back instantly, and it driving Aunt Petunia crazy. And so in this chapter, when they're at the zoo, Harry ends up accidentally vanishing the glass for the snake exhibit, for the snake tank, as they're in the reptile house at the zoo. And of course, in the film, we get the scene where Dudley falls in and the glass reappears and he's trapped in there, whatever. But the whole point of this is to give us context to Harry's magic and unexplained things happening around Harry. And so that kind of brings us to the end of the second chapter, where, like I said, we're given all this setup to the circumstances of Harry's being raised by the Dursleys, the situations he finds himself in, and that really propels us then into chapter 3. So this is called The Letters from No One. Harry is grounded, as much more grounded as he already can be. Of course, he's still in the cupboard under the stairs. And this chapter talks about moving into the school year. So this chapter now, we're in July. Harry's birthday is at the end of July. That's very important for the rest of the series, going forward with some plot lines that we won't talk about here for spoiler reasons. But Harry, his birthday is July 31st. And as we're approaching his birthday, the big conversation around the tea table at the Dursleys is Dudley is starting a new school. I believe it's Smeltings is the name of the school. It's Uncle Vernon's alma mater. They have some garish uniforms. I believe it's maroon and orange are their color scheme. Dudley gets to walk around with this very pompous walking stick that all of the students have, and he like repeatedly beats Harry with it or whips Harry with it, whatever. Meanwhile, Harry is being sent off to kind of this lesser school. His uniforms are being boiled and dyed by Aunt Petunia. It's actually a deleted scene in the film. You can find it probably on the I'm guessing the Peacock version. If you have Peacock in the United States, I don't know if it's elsewhere around the world, but they do have the extended version on Peacock, and I'm guessing that scene is also in there as well. But you can see Aunt Petunia boiling Harry's clothes. That's the context of that, is she's trying to shrink Dudley's old clothes because Dudley is so much bigger than Harry. And so as we approach the start of the school year, which they still have a month to go, but everybody's kind of getting ready for it, all of a sudden the mail comes in one day. And Harry gets a letter, quite literally from no one. There's no post address, there's no return address, but it quite comedically is sent to Mr. H. Potter, Mr. H. Potter, the cupboard under the stairs, 4 Privet Drive, Little Whinging, Surrey. And the kind of creepiness of this, it's more comedic as you read the book, because then you understand it. He's not being stalked, it's just magic. No one is actively watching him, it's just magic. But of course, the context in the Muggle world, in the non-wizarding world that we see, is they believe that they're constantly being watched. So Harry gets this letter specifically addressed to him, and it's saying, of course, we know that you are living in the cupboard under the stairs. But there's no return address. There's only this crest on the front, which of course we will later learn is the Hogwarts crest. But he's so shocked to actually get mail. He's never got a present in his life. He's never been given mail in his life. He has no living relatives, which seems like a major plot hole, but it actually makes a lot of sense the more you dive into it. Harry has no living relatives outside Aunt Petunia. And so the fact that someone would be writing to him is just fascinating, not only to him, but to all of the Dursleys. And so Harry kind of grabs the mail. He's sent to grab the mail, and he sees this letter, and he picks it out of the pile. And he walks back in, and he hands everybody else their mail, and he sits in the corner and just kind of stares at it. And he doesn't open it yet because he's still too shocked. And then Dudley notices him and just starts screaming about the fact that Harry got a letter, like nobody should be writing to Harry. And Uncle Vernon freaks out because as soon as he picks up the letter and sees the crest, he realizes what's going on. Because as much as Aunt Petunia and Uncle Vernon want to pretend that they know nothing about the wizarding world, that the wizarding world doesn't exist, they do have a pretty decent understanding of how it works. Aunt Petunia, as we learn later on in the series, knows pretty specifically how the wizarding world works, and they have clearly talked about it between themselves before, and have been dreading the day that these letters actually come to Harry. And so Uncle Vernon takes the letter away, he shreds it, he throws it away, he burns it. There's a variety of different scenes where the next day more letters come, again addressed to Harry at the cupboard under the stairs. And the more that he is unable to actually open this letter and read it, the more the letters come, to the point where it gets comedic. He plots to wake up super early and go down the street and steal the mail from the mailman so he can actually read his letter before he gets back. But of course, Uncle Vernon anticipates this and sleeps in front of the front door, and Harry trips on him in the middle of the night, and then he gets grounded even further. Of course, in the film, we get the specific visuals of Uncle Vernon drilling the mail flap shut. They block the fireplace because the letters keep coming no matter what. But Harry is so desperate to get these letters, and Uncle Vernon is so desperate for him not to get the letters, that it creates significant tension in the household, of course. And so then it gets to the point where the letters keep coming and constantly coming, and there's owls, and it is just a nightmare for the Dursleys, who are so desperate to look normal to their neighbors, that finally Uncle Vernon freaks out, has this massive just panic attack, blows up in front of the family, and uproots them completely. Heads out of town, they head to this hotel, the letters still come. And the bit of comedy in this chapter is no matter where they move to, the letters to Harry are still addressed not only just to him, but to their specific location, to the point where Uncle Vernon sends them to this out of nowhere, like off the coast of England, this tiny little shack where they have to row a boat across the bay all day until they get to this tiny little island with this tiny little hut where there are basically no electricity, no TV, no anything. Dudley is making a huge fit of it. He wants his computer. He misses his video games. And all of this simply because Uncle Vernon is just fed up with all of these letters. And when Harry finally gets his final letter, it's addressed to Mr. H. Potter, Mr. H. Potter. It's the hut on the rock, or the hut on the cliff, middle of the sea, is how it's addressed. That's not the specific address, but it's very specific where it's addressed to. And of course, like I said, he's not being stalked. This is magic. It's a magical letter that will find him no matter what. But that brings us to the end of chapter 3 and into chapter 4, the Keeper of the Keys. Now, at the end of chapter 3, they're in this hut, and there's all of a sudden banging on the door. It's Harry's birthday. He's counting down because only he is going to celebrate it. He has this little tiny watch that he was given from Dudley, and he is desperately waiting for his birthday because he's about to turn 11 years old. And for whatever reason, he feels like that's significant because you're only 11 once. And he's waiting, he's counting down, and all of a sudden, it's midnight, and he's 11 years old, and then the door starts banging. And it starts banging, and it keeps banging, and there's a storm outside, and the door is banging almost off its hinges, and it ends on a cliffhanger there. And of course, me, when I was 6 years old, and I'm reading Harry Potter, and I know the basic premise of Harry Potter, and I'm waiting for Hermione and Ron to show up, I'm thinking, oh, I hope it's Hermione and Ron, but of course it's not. Because the person that comes through the door is a gigantic human being, who we learn is named Rubeus Hagrid. Now, Hagrid is a character that we've already seen before, of course. He showed up in the first chapter, but he returns to Harry after 10 years away. And in the film, of course, we get the confusion with Dudley. In the book, he doesn't recognize Harry. It's been so long since he's seen him. And he kind of has these interactions where Hagrid is trying to remember how much Harry would possibly remember him. And like we mentioned in last episode, Harry would have been interacting with Hagrid, maybe even talking to Hagrid, the day that Hagrid took him from his parents' house. So these two are reunited after 10 years. And Hagrid finally gives him his letter, and Mr. Dursley is desperate that Harry not open it. And finally things blow up, where Hagrid basically threatens Mr. Dursley, forces him to sit down, and tells Harry the truth about who he is. And now this is where we get a significant deviation from the films, at least in a just what we have seen legacy-wise from the films, right? It's a very iconic scene. Harry wants to know who he is. Hagrid has to explain it to him. And of course, in the films, we get the line, "You're a wizard, Harry." And interestingly enough, it's one of those misquotes, or at least from the original source material, that is the quote in the film. People always quote it right from the film. It's not like Star Wars where people get the "Luke, I'm your father" line wrong. But it's interesting that in the books, he precedes the "You're a wizard" line with Harry's name. So instead of "You're a wizard, Harry," it's "Harry, you're a wizard." So an interesting change that they made from the books because of the fact that that line has lasted so long from the films. It's personally, like I'm recording the audiobooks for The Hunger Games. And so one thing that struck me when I was reading The Hunger Games is in the books, Katniss isn't called the girl on fire. She's called the girl who was on fire. And so we see this a lot in media where filmmakers or authors will give permission to filmmakers to change lines or change aspects to maybe make them more marketable. And in Harry Potter, I don't know if that's the case. I don't have the script in front of me. I couldn't tell you if they changed the line for the film, if it was a conscious effort, but regardless, it's a different line, which is kind of interesting. But it's still followed, of course, by Harry's iconic, "I'm a what?" And so then Hagrid goes into the truth about the car crash. And it wasn't a car crash. And he's appalled that Harry thinks it's a car crash. And he goes off on Mr. Dursley. And then he calls him a muggle. And so that's when we really get the first use of the word muggle against another muggle. And it's interesting in reading the book, it's very much used in the context of a slur. Hagrid uses it very aggressively toward Mr. Dursley, almost like some kind of social slur. But then he explains to Harry what a muggle is. Of course, then we get variations on that in the future of the series now with the American context with Fantastic Beasts. Of course, they call them no-mages. But muggle is the British term in the wizarding world for a non-magical person, or a person who is not born into a magical family. We'll talk a little bit more about squibs in book 2. But then Hagrid goes on to tell Harry just kind of the briefest story he can about Voldemort, or Voldemort if you want to pronounce the T. Where Hagrid basically kind of sets up this dark wizard who is gone from the world, but the whole history of the Dark Lord and the Death Eaters and just what happened prior to his downfall with Harry Potter terrifies Hagrid to the point where he is scared to say the name. He does end up saying it, but he's terrified by what power that name has, and he doesn't want to use it again. And then we get some bits of comedy in there. Hagrid pulls an entire owl out of his jacket to send a letter back to Dumbledore. He gives Harry his letter. Harry opens it, and it's basically an invitation to Hogwarts, a wizarding school that he has essentially been destined for his entire life. We learn later on in the series that every person born with magical ability is destined for Hogwarts, is magically enrolled in the school from the time of their birth by it's either the Quill of Acceptance and the Book of Admission. I can't remember the order of those two magical items. But Harry is destined for Hogwarts. And he gets his letter. It's written from Minerva McGonagall, of course, we see in Chapter 1. And it's instructing him to get his supplies for the upcoming school year. And they'll leave, of course, for term the start of September. Hagrid sends a letter back to Dumbledore saying, I got Harry, we're going to go shopping tomorrow, blah, blah, blah. And then Hagrid mentions an interesting... Well, actually, he has an interaction with Dudley where he basically turns Dudley into a pig, or attempts to turn Dudley into a pig, screws up the spell, and gives Dudley a pigtail. And it's a little bit of comedy. But we get an interesting character bit with Hagrid where after he turns Dudley, or gives Dudley a pig's tail, Hagrid mentions to Harry not to bring that up with anybody, because technically Hagrid isn't supposed to be doing magic. And it's the first indication we have of Hagrid's backstory, where it's not exactly as it should be, because he was expelled from Hogwarts in his 3rd year, and this is given to us in the 4th chapter. And we get a little backstory to Hagrid, and it kind of paints him in this... He's a very, very nice person, but he's kind of got a mysterious and a little bit of a dark backstory. And so we're kind of on edge with this character, and we end the chapter with them going to sleep in the hut. Dursleys are off doing their own thing, and Harry and Hagrid are doing another, setting us up for Harry's initiation into the wizarding world, which we'll talk about in the few chapters going forward. So that is chapters 2 through 4. I mentioned a little bit of the differences between the book version and the film version. I couldn't tell you off the top of my head the differences in the British book version versus the American book version. But that is essentially Harry's entire life, at least in the text, with what we have for chapters 2 through 4, or where we see him prior to his engagement in the wizarding world. Of course, the next chapter is Diagon Alley. We'll talk a little bit about the wizarding world going forward, his initiation, like I said, into the wizarding world, the journey from platform 9 3/4. And it's, I think, a fantastic opening to the novel. I mentioned last episode, this book is so meticulously planned that it's very obvious that in the multiple times that J.K. Rowling was rejected from publishers, she went back and revised things. And this book is so tight, and all of the character workings are so meticulously crafted. I know I've been using that word a lot, but meticulously crafted to properly portray the characters that we have in the story. It's not always the case in books where you get interactions between characters this early on that we see the core fundamental just character beats and character motivations come through in their words and their interactions. And the one thing that I didn't touch on that I wanted to lead into with saying that is in this last chapter, chapter 4, we get an excellent admission of basically jealousy from Aunt Petunia, where as soon as Hagrid reveals to Harry the truth about his parents, Harry kind of flips on his aunt and uncle and says, "You told me they died in a car crash." And then all of a sudden we get this bizarre interaction from Aunt Petunia where she really, really gets to shine. And we see it in the film. Fiona Shaw I'm a huge Fiona Shaw fan, first and foremost, but her portrayal of this scene is one of her best performances, honestly, ever, where she basically admits that she has always hated her sister. And we don't exactly know why this early on. Later on, of course, we learn it's because she was jealous of her sister. And she has tried her entire life to suppress that jealousy and make it turn into a kind of demonition of her sister, a just evilizing of everything her sister has done to justify her not living up to her sister's model, if that makes any sense. And so, without spoiling anything for later on, Aunt Petunia reveals that she always thought her sister was a freak, and she had to go off to that one school, and she was always jealous of the fact that their parents always favored the freak in the family. And of course she would hide it from Harry because she didn't want Harry to end up just like her freak of or just like his freak of a mother and his good-for-nothing father. And it's a very, very good interaction. And of course, going back to it, once you've actually read the entirety of the series and you understand Petunia's backstory to the Wizarding world, this chapter and that scene specifically for her just carries that much more weight. And so a fantastic chapter, fantastic character work, and just setting things up for the future of the story. So that's where we leave things at the end of chapter 4. And that's where we'll leave things for kind of the root of this podcast today. So to close today, I mentioned if you guys have questions or comments that you want to make about these chapters, feel free to do so on the YouTube channel. Of course, you can find this live stream channel at Echo Wirm Audiobooks, Wirm spelled with an I. If you want to check out all of our full-form content that we have available on YouTube, you can find that just at Echo Wirm, 2 separate channels at the moment. You can find all of our Harry Potter readings for free. Patreon.com/EchoWirm, Wirm spelled with an I. You shouldn't have to pay for anything to get access to our Harry Potter material. It should be available for you for free, as well as on Vimeo.com. That's Vimeo.com/EchoWirm, or excuse me, just search EchoWirm. I can't remember what our exact showcase number is, but you can find all of our Harry Potter content there if you want to listen along as well. The future of the channel, if you guys are subscribers on YouTube, right now we are going through the last of the Heroes of Olympus series. Eventually, of course, we'll talk about Percy Jackson on this podcast. We'll continue through Harry Potter until we're done with it, and then, like I said, we'll move on to Percy Jackson. But if you guys want to subscribe to the YouTube channel, feel free to do so. We'd love to have you around, and stay tuned for more stuff coming up. Every other Thursday that we're not doing these live streams, we will, of course, be doing our open Q&A live streams where you can ask us anything from Harry Potter, anything from Percy Jackson, anything from The Hunger Games, from anything that we cover on the channels. But we'd love to see you over there. Like I said, if you are an Apple podcast listener or a Spotify listener and you want to make your way over to YouTube to listen to these live as they air on Thursdays, we'd love to see you there. That's all I have for you guys today. We hope to see you in a couple weeks' time where we talk about Harry's introduction into the Wizarding world in chapters 5, 6, and going on.